So today, we are in the third episode of our summer sermon series on the book of Ruth, a revolutionary romance that is filled with drama and suspense, and lots of emotions in between. But before we dive into today's episode, here's a quick recap of the first two chapters. If you've been with us the last 2 weeks, you'll remember that Naomi left Israel due to a famine and went to Moab, a neighboring land, where her sons married Moabite women. When her husband and both her sons die, she decides to return to Bethlehem, heartbroken, bitter, and vulnerable. Last week, we learned that Naomi does not return alone and that Ruth, her daughter-in-law, who is also a widow, sees Naomi now as part of her family. And she famously says these words, "Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your God will be my God." So in chapter 1 and 2, Ruth is the one who makes the decisions to help carry the story move along. She takes initiative. She sacrifices her own cultural norms and identity and wholeheartedly commits to be there for Naomi in her time of need. And last week, as the credits rolled on chapter 2, we began to see a glimpse of what their life in Bethlehem was like. Seeking food for them both, Ruth found a field to glean and the favor of a wealthy landowner named Boaz, who offers her praise, feeds her, and instructs his workers to care for her safety. But we also see at the end of last week that the women are at a crossroads. The harvest season has ended. The food source has stopped. What comes next for these two widowed women? This is where Naomi takes the reins, and with a heart of wisdom and careful planning, and some say even with a bit of manipulation, this is where the story starts to get interesting, really interesting. Because Naomi understands the customs of the day, and that means that there is a way for Ruth to find security and a future for both of them. But she has to secure a husband for Ruth. So she gives her some interesting instructions. She tells her to go to the threshing floor and approach Boaz in the middle of the night, after he has been eating and drinking. Now, the threshing floor is on the outskirts of town, and it's often where the men went after the harvest. It's also where prostitutes might meet them in the middle of the night. So let's pause here for a moment. This was not a simple request that Naomi was giving to Ruth. Her plan was bold and fraught with risk. Ruth, a Moabite woman and a widow, was stepping into a space that was dominated by men out on the threshing floor. And Boaz was a man of influence and integrity in the community. How was this going to play out? It seems quite strange to us, but the Hebrew law has a law that says the next of kin or kinsman / redeemer was expected to take care of widowed women without children. And to marry them and to tend to their welfare was the honorable thing to do. So we learn in chapter 1, and it's confirmed again today, that Boaz is Naomi's kinsman. So she hatches this plan for Ruth to forge a relationship with Boaz in the cover of darkness. Now, we don't know why Naomi chooses to broker this deal in the nighttime and not in the light of day, but we do know that she sends Ruth on this undercover mission at night, and Ruth obeys Naomi's instructions. She washed herself, she anointed herself, and she dressed in her best clothes. Now, this symbolizes her transformation from a mourning widow to one who sees hope. It's in the stillness of the night she approached Boaz, laying down and uncovering his feet. Now, this is where it gets more scandalous. Feet in this context could be a euphemism for other things, or it may be just feet. Commentators are up in the air about it. It doesn't matter, but it does help us to understand that original hearers of this story and where they might, what they might understand. Because it doesn't get specific, we don't know exactly what is insinuated here. But what we do know, and what original hearers of the story would also know, is that Ruth remains a foreigner, a Moabite. And Moabites, as you might remember, were hated and reviled by Israel, which makes what happens next in the story even more surprising and scandalous. Ruth extends a marriage proposal to Boaz. When she asks Boaz to spread his cloak over her, that is slang for, "Will you marry me?" He, of course, awakens and finds her at his feet, where he initially seems startled and perhaps even a bit flattered, as it appears there are younger candidates in town. But he was not put off by her request. He sees a problem with this plan that has been presented, however, for he is not the closest relative. Before committing, he needs to ensure that he would not culturally overstep his bounds by marrying her. So here we have all of this activity, and in the middle of the night, where Ruth has come alongside Boaz, he has her stay through the morning. And it is in this evening that through the second time, he recognized her loyalty to Naomi and her noble character. You see, he doesn't see a foreign widower. He doesn't see an outcast or one to be reviled or hated. He sees a woman of worth and says to her, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter, by the God that she has chosen to come and follow. This last instance of your loyalty is even better than the first." You might remember from last week that he acknowledged her when he said to her at the field, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law has been told to me about the death of your husband, how you left your father and your mother, and you came to this unknown land and to a people that you didn't know." This first blessing, he says to her, "May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." The world has 1,000 ways to drain our hope and our courage and our trust in God, doesn't it? So no matter how close to God or how far away from God you feel today, no matter what life circumstance has left you feeling lost or in despair, no matter what uncertainty lies ahead or is looming out in front of you, or no matter what seeds of bitterness may have rooted in your heart because of life's disappointment or grief or feeling forsaken yourself, no matter what difficult decision is lurking in your mind today, know that you matter to God, and you too have refuge under God's wings. When Ruth returned to Naomi, she carried with her a heart filled with hope and a shawl filled with grain. Boaz again showed this outsider and this foreigner generosity, and his actions are a powerful illustration of God's loyal love to Ruth and by extension to us. While you may not be able to see or feel God's love today, the good news is that, as St. Augustine has said, and as Liz introduced in episode 1, there is, in fact, a golden thread of God's love and provision that is working behind the scenes in your life. Sometimes, I think, it takes stories like Ruth to remind us of this truth, because we don't always see how our thread runs through our decision-making, our relationships, our experiences that we choose, and those we do not choose that happen to us. Guiding us, this thread offers us meaning and purpose in God's loyal love. But for most of us, I think it is only in hindsight, when we take a moment of quiet to look back and to reflect, that we don't always see the connections and how this thread runs through our lives. It's in hindsight, and sometimes it takes a while to come out of the hard thing that we are going through, where we finally can see God's gentle guidance and provision for us. But we know we don't get there overnight, do we? And there are often choices we need to make along the way, small ones and large ones, and some that might seem inconsequential. It's the impact that these choices have that will determine which way parts of our life will go. And sometimes we will find ourselves as a crossroads as well, just as Naomi and Ruth did, unsure of what the future holds, unsure of any provision at all, unsure of what next right step to take. So what does this book, this relatively short book of 4 chapters that we are spending 4 weeks to cover in the Old Testament, have to say to us today? These stories of these women who come from 2 different cultures and found one another and faced unimaginable hardships and vulnerabilities. They stick together after tragedy and after despair. And this story highlights for us God's hesed, God's loyal love, the Hebrew concept of kindness and loyalty that we have seen woven throughout this story. And it is this loyal love and kindness that does not come from grandiose actions of God, as I mentioned last week. Instead, it comes from how these women live this loyalty and connection out in daily living. Their relationship celebrates the ways we can care for one another when the world seems to be crashing around us, doing the next right thing, even in the midst of uncertainty and doubt that we feel or that those we are journeying with might feel. It also highlights, I think, a mutual vulnerability and understanding. I think in times of trial, that we can realize how much we need one another too. We need each other. We need to feel like we are belonging, a part of something that is, in fact, greater than ourselves, because that helps us to see stories like Ruth, give us a lens and a window into what might be going on in our lives that we can't quite put our finger on. The story of these characters that we've highlighted today are not yet over. And so we'll return next week for chapter 4 to see how it ends and why this book has been preserved of these 2 widowed women. But in the meantime, let today's episode remind us how Ruth embraced vulnerability, how she chose courage and boldness, how she dared to act, how she built trust and connection to live wholeheartedly in spite of her circumstances, and how Naomi, who is driven for concern for Ruth's future, acts out of love and care for her. Both of these women demonstrate a profound trust and boldness, daring to be courageous and daring to act in faith, something that we can be inspired by and emulate in our own lives. God calls us to be courageous. And in the book of Joshua, we hear, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you. Will be with you wherever you go." Ruth's journey from a foreign land to this marriage proposal shows us that no one is beyond the reach of God's grace and God's love. It also reminds us that God's presence can give us the strength to courageously face the uncertain times and fears that might be in front of us. And it's Naomi's wisdom and Boaz's integrity that remind us that God is often at work through the faithful actions of other people in our lives. Where are you seeing faithful people working in your life, in our community, in our world? So today, let us remember and embrace the courage that Ruth has, the wisdom of Naomi, and the integrity of Boaz. Let's this week step out in courage to trust that God hears our cries, sees our needs, and provides for us in ways that we cannot imagine or even see right now. And let us return next week to see how this story, this 4-chapter story in the Old Testament, unfolds and what it means for our faith story and our faith tradition as it points to the ultimate kinsman and redeemer. In the name of the triune God, amen.